This is HOA craze. She brought a ruler and a grudge. My name is Dan. I work as a landscape irrigation tech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the woman screaming at me in the subdivision entrance has a Ziploc bag full of sidewalk ice chips in her hand like it is Exhibit A in a murder trial. Her name is Pamela Lee, but everyone in the Landing at Icefall HOA calls her Susan, and right now she is telling me that the slush pile next to my driveway is a liability hazard and that I missed a mandatory hearing last Tuesday. I check my watch because I have a site visit in 40 minutes and a refinance approval hanging in the balance, and any lien threat over winter fees could derail the whole thing. Susan takes a step closer, her scarf flapping in the wind, and says, "This is not snow, it is non-compliance." I ask her what hearing she is talking about, because I never got a notice. She smiles, pulls a folded paper from her coat pocket, and says the notice was posted on the community board and emailed to all residents 3 weeks ago. I pull out my phone, show her my inbox, and there is nothing. She shrugs and says that is my problem, not hers, and that the board voted to fine me $250 for failure to appear and another $500 for the ongoing snowpile violation. I moved to Milwaukee 2 years ago for a stable irrigation job, and because the cost of living was better than the last city I tried, the Landing at Icefall HOA looked quiet when I toured the neighborhood, and the dues were reasonable. What I did not know was that Susan ran the welcome committee like a parole officer, and that every winter turned into a selective enforcement free-for-all. If you were on her good side, your 3-foot snowbank at the curb was fine. If you were not, she would measure it with a tape and write you up for encroachment. I have a custody and visitation routine with my daughter, and the HOA keeps targeting my schedule and my guests, writing up my driveway for ice patches on mornings when she stays over, claiming the extra car creates a safety issue. The stakes are real, because one more complaint to my landlord and I might have to move again, which would blow up my custody arrangement. Susan taps the Ziploc bag against her palm and says she collected these ice samples from my walkway yesterday morning, and that they prove I am not salting properly. I point out that the whole neighborhood is covered in ice because we just had freezing rain, and she cuts me off and says the rule is that walkways must be clear within 12 hours of precipitation ending. I ask her when the precipitation ended, because it was still sleeting when I left for work at 6. She ignores the question and says the hearing is already decided, the fines are already assessed, and if I do not pay within 10 days the HOA will file a lien. I feel my chest tighten, because a lien on the property means my refinance dies, and without that refinance I cannot afford to stay in this place long enough to keep my daughter close. I take a breath, check my watch again, and say I will file an appeal. Susan laughs and says appeals have to be submitted in writing within 48 hours of the hearing, and since the hearing was last Tuesday, I am already late. I say I will submit it today, and she says good luck with that, because the management company only processes appeals if they are submitted on the correct form, and the form is only available at the monthly board meeting, which is not for another 3 weeks. I walk back to my truck, and my neighbor 2 doors down, a guy named Rich, is shoveling his driveway. He waves me over and says he saw Susan measuring my walkway yesterday with a tape, and that she took photos on her phone. I ask him if he heard anything about a hearing, and he shakes his head and says he never got a notice either, but that Susan has been telling people at the mailboxes that the board is cracking down on winter violations because the HOA insurance rate went up. I thank him and drive to my site visit, and the whole way I am thinking about how Susan said the hearing already happened and the fines are already posted. When I get home that evening, there is a printed notice taped to my door. It is on HOA letterhead, dated 4 days ago, and it says I missed a compliance hearing, on a date I have never seen mentioned before. The violation listed is failure to maintain clear walkways and failure to remove snow piles within 24 hours of a snow event. The fine total is $750, and there is a line at the bottom that says additional daily penalties of $50 will apply until compliance is verified. I pull the notice off the door and look at the signature, and it is Susan's name, typed, with no actual signature. I call the management company the next morning, and the woman who answers says she will look into it and call me back. I wait 2 hours, then call again, and this time, I get voicemail. I leave a message explaining that I never received notice of the hearing, and that the violation dates do not match any snow event I remember. I wait another day, and finally the management company calls back and says the hearing was properly noticed and that the board has the authority to assess fines for non-compliance. I ask for a copy of the notice I supposedly received, and she says it was posted on the community board and sent via email. I say I never got the email, and she says that is not the HOA's problem, and that if I want to appeal I need to submit the form at the next board meeting. I hang up and sit in my truck, staring at the dashboard, because I am running out of time, and the refinance company just emailed me asking if there are any liens or pending legal actions against the property. That afternoon, I drive to the post office and talk to the mail carrier who handles our routes. Her name is Janine, and she has been delivering mail in this neighborhood for 6 years. I ask her if she remembers seeing any HOA notices posted on the community board in the last month, and she says she has seen Susan posting notices repeatedly, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single day, but that half the time the notices are gone by the next morning. She says it has become a thing in the neighborhood, where people think Susan is posting notices and then removing them before anyone can respond, so that she can claim the notice period passed. I asked Janine if she would be willing to make a statement about that, and she says she will do it if I need her to, because she is tired of seeing people get pushed around. I thank her and drive home, and when I pull into my driveway, Susan is standing at the curb with a tape measure stretched over my shoveled path. She sees me, waves the tape, and says my walkway is 3 inches too narrow, and that the HOA code requires a minimum of 36 inches for accessibility. I get out of my truck and measure the walkway myself, and it is 38 inches. Susan says the tape does not lie, and that she is reporting this as a new violation. I take a photo of my own measurement, and she says photos can be edited, and that her word as an HOA officer is the official record. That night I start going through my emails, my texts, and my mail log, and there is no record of any hearing notice before the date on the fine letter. I pull up the HOA website and check the minutes from the last board meeting, and the minutes say a hearing was scheduled for compliance violations, but there is no list of which properties were included. I screenshot everything, then I call a friend who used to work in property management, and he tells me that if the HOA did not provide proper notice, the hearing is invalid, and any fines assessed are unenforceable. He says I need to get written confirmation from the city or county that the HOA misrepresented an ordinance in writing, because that gives me leverage if this goes legal. I ask him how I do that, and he says I need to file a public records request with the city asking for any correspondence between the HOA and the city regarding snow removal ordinances, and if the city says there is none, then the HOA has been making up rules. I file the request the next day, and the city clerk tells me it will take about a week to process. In the meantime, Susan escalates. I come home from work, and there is a new notice on my door, this one saying that the HOA board held an emergency executive session and voted to assess an additional $500 fine for repeat violations and failure to comply with remediation orders. The notice is dated today, which means the so-called emergency session happened while I was at work, and again, I got no advance notice. I take a photo of the notice, then I go next door and ask Rich if he heard anything about an emergency meeting. He says no, and that he has been home all day and did not see any cars at the clubhouse. I walk over to the clubhouse, and the door is locked, and there are no meeting postings on the window. I take another photo, then I sit in my truck and call the management company again. This time I get a different person, and I explain the whole situation, the missing notices, the fabricated dates, the fines piling up with no hearing. The guy on the phone sounds sympathetic but says he cannot override board decisions, and that my only option is to appeal at the next board meeting or hire an attorney. I do not have the money for an attorney right now, so I decide to go to the next board meeting myself. The meeting is scheduled for the following Thursday, and I show up 15 minutes early with a folder full of printed emails, photos, and my timeline of events. The meeting room is in the clubhouse, and when I walk in, Susan is already there, sitting at the head of the table with a stack of binders in front of her. There are 3 other board members, all older, and they barely look up when I enter. I take a seat in the back row, and Susan starts the meeting by reading through the minutes from the last session. When she gets to the part about compliance hearings, she says that several properties were fined for winter violations, and she lists my address along with 2 others. I raise my hand, and Susan ignores me. I raise my hand again, and one of the other board members nudges her and points at me. Susan sighs and says yes. I stand up and say I never received notice of the hearing, and that I have documentation proving the email was never sent. Susan cuts me off and says the notice was posted on the community board, and that email delivery issues are not the HOA's responsibility. I say the board has a legal obligation to provide notice, and she says the board followed all procedures, and that this matter is closed. I sit down, and Susan moves on to the next agenda item, which is a discussion about snow removal vendor contracts. I wait for the public comment period, but there is not one. The meeting ends after 20 minutes, and Susan gathers her binders and walks out without making eye contact. I follow her into the parking lot and say I am filing a formal appeal, and she says I can do whatever I want, but the fines stand and the lien process has already started. I ask her how the lien process can start when I have not had a chance to appeal, and she says I had my chance when I missed the hearing. I say I did not miss it, I was never told about it, and she smiles and says, I have done this before, and people fold every time. Then she gets in her car and drives away. The next morning I get a call from the city clerk, and she says my public records request came back with no results, meaning the city has no record of any communication with the Landing at Icefall HOA regarding snow ordinances. She sends me a signed letter confirming that, and I print 3 copies. Now I have proof that the HOA has been misrepresenting city rules, which is exactly what my friend said I needed. I also have Janine's statement about Susan posting and removing notices, and I have my own log showing that I never received the hearing notice. I start to feel like maybe I have a case, but then Susan shows up at my house again, this time with a camera. She is standing in my driveway, filming my front walkway, and she is narrating into the camera, saying that this property has failed to maintain safe conditions and that the HOA has documented multiple violations. I step outside and ask her what she is doing, and she keeps filming and says she is creating a record for the HOA attorney. I tell her to get off my property, and she says the driveway easement is HOA common area and she has the right to inspect it. I pull out my phone and start recording her, and she immediately stops filming and says I am harassing her. I say I am doing exactly what she is doing, and she says, if I do not stop, she will call the police. I keep recording and she storms off, still holding her camera. That afternoon I get an email from the management company saying the HOA attorney has requested documentation of all compliance actions taken against my property, and that a hearing will be scheduled to determine whether the fines will be converted into a lien. The email says I have 7 days to submit any evidence I want the attorney to consider. I reply immediately and attach the city letter, Janine's statement, my email logs, and the photos showing that Susan's tape measure was wrong. I also write a cover letter explaining that the HOA never provided proper notice and that Susan has been manipulating the process to target specific homeowners. I hit send, and then I wait. 3 days later, I get a call from a number I do not recognize. It is the HOA attorney, and he says he has reviewed my evidence and that he has some concerns about the way the hearing was conducted. He says he is recommending that the board void the fines and issue a formal apology, and that he is also recommending that the management company review their notice procedures to make sure this does not happen again. I ask him if that means the lien is off the table, and he says yes, the lien will not be filed. I thank him and hang up, and for the first time in weeks I feel like I can breathe. But Susan is not done. 2 days later, we get hit with another snowstorm. A big one, and the plows come through in the middle of the night and shove a massive pile of snow into the end of my driveway. I wake up at 5 in the morning and spend an hour digging out, and by the time I finish, I am late for work. I throw the shovel in the garage and drive off, and when I come home that evening, there is a new notice on my door. This one says I violated the 24-hour snow removal rule, and that the fine is $300. I rip the notice off the door and call the management company, and the same guy I talked to before says he will look into it, but that the board has the right to enforce the rules as written. I say the rule is impossible to follow when the plows come through in the middle of the night and bury the driveway again, and he says that is not the HOA's problem. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmares and neighborhood drama. I start to realize that Susan is going to keep doing this until she either breaks me or I find a way to stop her permanently. I go back through all the notices I have received, and I notice something strange. The dates on the notices do not match the dates of the actual snow events. In one case, the notice says I failed to clear my walkway within 12 hours of a storm that happened 3 days earlier. In another case, the notice claims I had ice on my walkway on a day when the temperature never dropped below 40 degrees. I pull up the weather records from the National Weather Service, print them out, and add them to my folder. Now I have proof that Susan is fabricating violations by altering dates and recycling photos from previous storms. I also find out that the neighbor I thought was neutral, a woman named Carol who lives across the street, has been feeding information to Susan. Rich tells me that Carol has been taking photos of my driveway every morning and texting them to Susan, and that Susan has been using those photos to write up violations even when there is no actual problem. I confront Carol the next time I see her at the mailboxes, and she does not deny it. She says Susan asked her to help monitor the neighborhood for safety issues, and that she is just doing her part. I ask her if she knows that Susan has been using fake dates and fabricated violations, and she says that is between me and the HOA, and that she does not want to get involved. I walk away, and I realize that Susan has built a whole network of people who are willing to help her enforce rules that do not exist. The next escalation comes in the form of a fabricated violation notice with altered dates and recycled photos. I get home from work and find an envelope taped to my door. Inside is a notice claiming I failed to remove ice from my walkway on a date 2 weeks ago, and attached is a photo that I recognize because it is the same photo Susan took when she was standing at my curb with the tape measure. The date on the notice is different, but the photo is identical, right down to the angle and the snow piled on the left side of the frame. I take a photo of the notice, and I pull up the original photo I took that day, and the timestamps match, proving that Susan used the same photo twice and just changed the violation date. I add this to my folder, and now I have evidence that Susan is not just manipulating the process, she is committing fraud. I call the HOA attorney again, and this time I do not ask, I tell him what is happening. I say that Susan is fabricating violations, using fake dates and recycling photos, and that I have documentation proving all of it. I say that if the board does not take action, I am going to file a complaint with the state attorney general, and I am going to sue the HOA for harassment and fraud. The attorney goes quiet for a moment, then he says he will bring this to the board and recommend that they take immediate corrective action. I hang up and wait. 2 days later, Susan tries to corner me at the gas station lot at the edge of the subdivision. I am filling my tank and she pulls up in her car, parks behind me so I cannot leave, and gets out with her camera. She starts filming me and saying that I have been harassing her and threatening her and that she has documented everything. I stay calm, pull out my phone, and start recording her. I say that I have not threatened anyone and that I have been documenting her harassment and fraud. She steps closer, her scarf flapping in the wind, and she says, "This is not snow. It is non-compliance." I say, "You already used that line, and it did not work the first time." She says, "I am going to regret this," and I say, "Actually, I think you are." Then I reach into my truck, pull out a folder, and hand her a packet. Inside the packet is everything: the city letter confirming the HOA misrepresented the snow ordinance, Janine's statement about Susan posting and removing notices, the weather records proving the violation dates are fake, the side-by-side comparison of the recycled photo, and one more thing. I had filed a police report 2 weeks ago after Susan showed up at my house with the camera and refused to leave. The officer who responded did not arrest her, but he did take a statement and he gave me an incident number. I included a copy of that incident report in the packet, along with a note explaining that this is part of a pattern and that Susan has been using her position on the HO board to target and harass homeowners who do not comply with her demands. The incident report shows that this is not the first time Susan has been reported for trespassing and harassment, and that there is a prior complaint from another homeowner in the subdivision who moved out after Susan made their life miserable. Susan opens the packet, and I watch her face change as she flips through the pages. She gets to the police incident report, and her hand starts to shake. She looks up at me and says, "Where did you get this?" I say, "Public records." She says, "This is slander." I say, "No, it is documentation." She throws the packet on the ground, gets in her car, and drives off, tires spinning in the slush. That night I get a call from the HOA attorney, and he says the board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Susan from her role as welcome committee chair and to revoke her access to the HOA management portal. He says the board is also voiding all fines assessed against my property and issuing a formal apology. He says the management company is being disciplined and that the rep who enabled Susan's behavior has been removed from the account. He says the HOA is offering me a settlement that includes refunds for any fees I paid under protest and new limits on enforcement procedures to prevent this from happening again. I ask him if Susan is off the board entirely, and he says not yet, but that there is a recall petition circulating, and it looks like it has enough signatures. I thank him and hang up, and for the first time in months, I feel like I won. But the best part comes 3 days later. The subdivision has another snowstorm, and this one dumps 8 inches overnight. I wake up, shovel my driveway, salt my walkway, and head to work. When I come home that evening, Rich is waiting for me at the curb, and he is laughing so hard he can barely talk. He says Susan tried to manufacture evidence this morning by pouring water on the pavement near the mailboxes to create a black ice hazard, and that she was going to take photos and blame it on the HOA's failure to salt common areas. But Carol, the neighbor who had been spying for Susan, saw her doing it and recorded the whole thing on her phone. Carol sent the video to the HOA attorney, and now Susan is being investigated for vandalism and fraud. Rich says the board is meeting tomorrow night to discuss removing her entirely, and that the attorney has recommended filing a complaint with the state. I go to the board meeting the next night, and the room is packed, half the neighborhood is there, and everyone is talking about Susan. The board president opens the meeting by reading a statement explaining that Susan has been removed from all HOA committees, and that her board seat is under review, pending the outcome of the attorney's investigation. He says the HOA is committed to fair and transparent enforcement, and that new procedures are being put in place to prevent selective targeting. Then he opens the floor for public comment, and person after person stands up and tells stories about how Susan harassed them, fined them for fake violations, and made their lives miserable. One woman says Susan tried to fine her for having a wreath on her door in January, and another guy says Susan wrote him up for having tire tracks in his driveway. By the end of the meeting, the board votes unanimously to remove Susan from the board entirely, and the room erupts in applause. I walk out of the meeting, and Janine, the mail carrier, catches up with me in the parking lot. She says she is glad I stood up to Susan, because nobody else had the documentation or the patience to fight back. She says the neighborhood is already a different place, and that people are talking about running for the board in the next election to make sure this never happens again. I thank her for her help, and I drive home feeling lighter than I have in months. 2 weeks later, I get a letter from the HOA attorney with the final settlement agreement. The HOA is refunding all fines I paid, plus interest, and they are paying my legal consultation fees. The settlement includes a clause that prohibits the HOA from filing any winter-related violations against my property without photographic evidence, a timestamp, and written confirmation from a licensed inspector. The attorney also includes a note saying that the management company rep who helped Susan manipulate the records has been terminated, and that the new rep has implemented a digital tracking system to prevent notice tampering. I sign the agreement, deposit the refund check, and finally, I can focus on my daughter and my work without worrying about a lien or a fake fine. Susan moves out of the neighborhood 3 months later. I hear from Rich that she could not handle the recall, the investigation, and the fact that everyone in the subdivision knew what she had done. She lists her house, sells it in 2 weeks, and disappears. Carol, the neighbor who had been spying for Susan, apologizes to me at the mailboxes one morning, and she says she did not realize how far Susan was willing to go, and that she feels terrible for helping her. I tell her I appreciate the apology, and that I hope she learned something about standing up when you see someone being targeted. The next winter, the HOA hires a professional snow removal company, and the new board implements a clear policy: walkways and driveways must be cleared within 48 hours of a storm, and fines can only be assessed after a written warning and photographic evidence. The policy is posted on the website, emailed to all residents, and printed in the monthly newsletter. No more secret hearings, no more fake notices, no more selective enforcement. The neighborhood finally feels like a place I can live without looking over my shoulder. I still check my watch constantly because of work deadlines, and I still keep a folder in my truck with all the documentation from the Susan saga, just in case. But now, when I pull into my driveway, after a long day, I do not see a notice taped to my door. I see my daughter's bike leaning against the garage, and I see my neighbors waving from their porches, and I see a subdivision that finally figured out how to treat people fairly. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.